the movement of Christianity, or whatever you're talking about, democracy or art or whatever it is, you refuse to allow it to remain open to the future, and you freeze it. It becomes like a frozen waterfall, a freeze frame, a pause in a video stream. And you say, that's the absolute unchanging essence. Well, it's not. It's just the freeze frame.
Kill the darlings. Nothing grows under sheets and stone.
The Deconstructionist podcast is produced by Nicholas Rowe at the National Audio Preservation Society Recording Studio in Newark, Ohio.
Follow us on social media at www.thedeconstructionist.com, on Facebook at Deconstructionist Podcast, Twitter at DeconstructCast, and Instagram at Deconstructionist Podcast.
If listening to this podcast has benefited you in any way, or if you have connected with it, or it's resonated somewhere with you, please consider making a donation. Even the smallest donations go to help John and I maintain healthy relationships with our wives and keeps their blood pressure at a healthy level. The donate link is in the show notes, or you can visit our website and click the donate tab.
Kill the darlings, then you'll know where your heart is found.
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. We are your hosts, John Williamson
and Adam Narlock. I'm so glad that our Reconstruction episode aired. We kind of tried to plan this out, but we didn't really realize that Caputo was going to be after the Reconstruction episode, which I think he would actually appreciate.
I think it's perfect.
So who do we got this week?
So we've got John D. Caputo.
Jack.
He goes by
Jackie.
Jack. Yeah.
Jackie boy.
He's like the godfather
Oh my gosh.
of philosophy.
When we started this thing on Twitter, as soon as certain people latched onto that handle that we chose, that Deconstructionists handle, they were like, do you know Caputo? Are you going to get Caputo? Could you get Caputo? Have you read Caputo? Caputo. And it was I hated to be I've read a little, I know who he is, but then of course I had to get into it, and it's whoa.
Dude, and for those of you out there listening who are huge fans as we are of our good friend Peter Rollins, Caputo was hugely influential.
Rollins calls him his mentor.
Yeah,
all the time.
So of course we had to get him.
They're still doing events together.
Oh man!
And then we have another. Oh, I can't talk about that yet, can I?
I don't know where you're going with this.
the bonus, the PNP with P.
Oh yeah.
We can't talk about that.
It's coming soon, though.
We have an Easter egg.
Yeah, we do.
Coming in the dead of summer.
You guys are going to enjoy that one.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
This next month is just going to be killer.
Let's talk about Jack.
All right.
Who is this guy? Who is John D. Caputo?
So he is just brilliant philosopher who also specializes in hermeneutics and theology, and really is just hugely influenced by Jacques Derrida.
So are we.
Yeah. Absolutely. So he was perfect.
Oh.
So he really was the perfect guy to have on to really break down what is deconstruction.
Wouldn't you say he's the next perfect? And I don't mean to subordinate him at all, because he stands on his own. But if we could have gotten Jacques Derrida, that would be great. But we couldn't because he's dead.
Right.
So Jack Caputo. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, the guy is just an absolute brilliant guy, and took some time out of his busy schedule to talk with us. And I think one of the things that we tried to get across in last week's episode is just that Reconstruction is built into deconstruction, and he really just nails that.
Oh,
so Yeah, I think you guys are going to love him. He's got a PhD in philosophy. He's been a college professor for quite some time at both Villanova University and Syracuse University. Just a brilliant guy and so gracious with his time.
One of the things that I love about the fact that we got Jack Caputo is, you know, that I have a huge crush on Karen Armstrong.
Yeah, you do.
And in her book, The Case for God, at the very end, in her chapter on the death of God, she talks about Caputo as this pioneer in theology after the death of God. So if you're curious at all about what it means after these philosophers like Nietzsche and, you know, Camus and Sartre and all these people that just completely lambasted belief in God and made way for the new atheism, Caputo and his idea of deconstruction as an affirmative of mystery and an affirmative of that which keeps just coming in. You guys are going to love this episode. And with that, we can do nothing else but let you listen to this fabulous interview. So, John, you got anything else?
No, without further ado.
Jack freaking
It could amaze
Caputo.
me if I were to step outside my door. And when, 'cause it would surely happen, discovering all that land and sea, and no one knows but me. And I've got nothing.
All right, well, Dr. Caputo, or as you like to be called, Jack Caputo, welcome to the Deconstructionist podcast. We are delighted to have you here with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we would love to just start. I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of our listeners aren't academics. They're, haven't been trained in the academy in the ways of theology and philosophy, but they're all interested, curious, whether they're outside a professing faith and they're just spiritually curious and looking to consume lots and lots of different perspectives. You would be a great one for all of them to read. But then us inside the church who are going through this kind of crisis of faith, kind of weird period, we also think that your work would be just wonderful for people to get acquainted with. So I was wondering if, just by way of introduction, I always like it when the guests introduce themselves rather than John and I doing it, because you guys obviously know yourselves quite a bit better than we do. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing the work that you're doing and that you're now sort of famous for?
Well, at this moment, I'm retired, and I spent my life, for the most part, in a philosophy department at Villanova University. And the last 7 years, I took an early retirement from Villanova to teach at Syracuse University in the religion department. And because my real interest in the philosophy department was the philosophy of religion, so that gave me a chance to work with students who were interested in getting a PhD in religion, but were interested in the philosophy of religion. And that proved to be quite a good decision. It was a lot of fun. I guess my real interest in all of this came from growing up in before the Second Vatican Council as a Roman Catholic and entering a Catholic religious order. And, encountering religion in a deadly serious way, with the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. And in that context, studying philosophy, learning about philosophy, and particularly in the Catholic tradition, where theology is very deeply saturated by philosophy. So I, from the very get-go, from the time I was 18 years old, I was deeply caught up in questions of theology and of philosophical theology. And then after I left the religious life, I was in a religious order for 4 years. After that, and when I went and got my PhD in philosophy, And then, I expanded my horizons, and I started to get interested in a broader conception of philosophy outside of the Catholic tradition. And first I found Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger, the great German philosopher who besmirched his name by getting involved with National Socialism.
Yeah.
He deserves all the criticism he gets for his completely odious politics, but at the same time, he was a great philosopher who said some tremendously important things. And he, at the time when I was studying him, I didn't know anything about all that stuff, or I'd only vaguely heard about it. And I was just emancipated by him. He just got me out of the Catholic world that I lived in and gave me a much broader and deeper appreciation for the history of philosophy and the sweep of philosophical questioning, and he just emancipated me. And then once I did that, once I got into Heidegger, then I got into continental philosophy generally. So all these names you hear about, first of all, years ago when I was a student, existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre, and those guys, Camus and Simone de Beauvoir, those people, they were the rage when I was a student.
Sure.
And they were sexy writers. I mean, they were really terrific. Engaging. Wonderful stuff. And when I first started teaching, I used to teach a lot of that stuff because if you can't teach existentialism, then you just can't teach at all. That's great stuff.
Yeah.
And so I fell in love with what you call continental European philosophy, French and German philosophy, and have ever since been working from the point of view of continental philosophy with the questions of religion. I mean, they were, I was always one way or another concerned with religion. My earliest book, very first book I ever wrote, was about Heidegger and Meister Eckhart, the great German mystic. Oh, yeah. Whom Heidegger was interested in, and it was fascinating to me. And then finally, I think sort of my journey sort of came into focus when I discovered Derrida and Deconstruction, and then that was the vocabulary and the framework that made the most sense to me. And once I found that, then I thought, well, that's it. This is what I've been looking for. This is the way I can. Not so much because it was a body of doctrines or teachings, but because it was a way of thinking that I appreciated, and it helped me make sense of religion insofar as I can lay claim to having made sense of religion.
Yeah, you just took us to our first question. Let's talk a little bit about that. So at Derrida, most of our audience is, just barely familiar just because we throw his name around, here and there. And we've diverted from the Derrida definition of deconstruction, but in a lot of ways, it seems like you did also. Would you talk a little bit about how Derrida's, what you said just now, it's not so much his doctrines, but the way he looked at it and how that formulated your idea of deconstruction, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think one way, the way I tend to put it nowadays is this. Derrida is a philosopher who thinks that the world we live in, the set of meanings, the beliefs and practices that we have accumulated are contingent. They're revisable. They're reformable. They have been constructed in time and history and circumstance, and they didn't drop from the sky.
Interesting.
They were laboriously constructed in history, and so they are, the way I like to put it, relatively stable unities. They are relatively stable constructions. If they weren't relatively stable, the world would just come apart on us and nothing. You'd have to reinvent the world every time you got up in the morning. You'd have to reinvent the wheel, But on the other hand, since they're only relatively stable, that means they're relatively unstable.
Right.
So, and then in his language, that means these constructions are deconstructable.
Huh.
They can be they can come unglued. They don't hang together in this absolutely tight knot that can't be loosened. They're revisable, reformable, reconstructible, reconstitutable. And then that's where things get interesting, because his critics say he doesn't believe anything. He thinks that anything goes. He thinks that whatever people say,
right.
His answer is, well, it's a contingent belief. It was constructed in space and time, and why do we have to believe it? We don't have to believe anything. We can believe whatever we want.
Right.
And that's not what he means. He means, first of all, these relatively stable constructions are important, and they're our inheritance. We've inherited words like democracy, say, and he says this is not trivial. This word democracy is very important. But it's not a god. It didn't drop from the sky. It was built in space and time by human beings who were trying to hammer out a way to be. And so it's not a pure essence. It's not a necessary being. It's a construction, and that means it can be revised. And you may screw it up when you revise it. You may ruin what was accomplished when you play with it. So it's dangerous.
Wow.
Business to mess with things. But if on the other hand you don't, it's even more dangerous. If you let this thing freeze in place, it may be dangerous to reconstruct things, but it's even more dangerous not to.
Man.
Because then they'll become monsters. They'll freeze over on you. So then later on in his work, and I think it was partly under the press of his critics, he started talking about something undeconstructible. You say, well, what in heaven's name could that be? Because he's just got done saying everything that we had to deal with was constructed in space and time. So what could be undeconstructible? Right. It sounds like like this Greek philosopher Plato, who talked about the eternal essences sort of in the sky. Right. Is that what he means? No, that's not what he means. He means words like democracy or justice or hospitality or forgiveness or gift, or there's a long list of things that he's analyzed. These words they make promises that aren't kept. So we inherit a word like democracy, and there's a promise in that word. There's something that we hear that doesn't exist. It's not here yet. It's not realized. It's more like a call which is calling to be made real, but it's not real. It's a hope. It's an expectation. It's a dream. In religion, you might say it's a prayer. And so he calls this the democracy to come. And he says, the democracy to come. He says, democracy in itself, if it exists, and it's the if that makes all the difference, because of course it does not. It never exists. It's always
to come,
calling us. So remember now that he's Jewish, and so now all of this is starting to sound a little bit like the Messiah. It's got a kind of messianic quality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Messianic justice. Only this Messiah never shows up. It's always to come. It's always ahead. So it's the very structure of the future which is unrealized. but which we're trying to realize, we want to realize, we hope for it, we love it, we desire it with a desire beyond desire and things like that. So when he said that, then he made it clear that deconstruction is not in any way, shape, or form some kind of anything goes nihilism, and some kind of absolute pure libertarian, do what you want. It's always, what makes things deconstructible is that they never meet the demands or the expectations of the undeconstructible. So what makes democracy deconstructible is that it's never the democracy to come. So he's not saying anything goes. He's saying we're never satisfied. These democracies around us now are not the democracy of which we dream.
Man.
So the undeconstructible shines a white light on the present, the constructions of the present, and shows their warts. It shows their defects, all of their shortcomings, and it sets in. So to deconstruct something is not to break it down or destroy it; it's to expose it to its future.
Oh my gosh!
Oh, that's good.
Wow. So I have a question. As a lay person, and a lot of lay people listening right now, what you're saying sounds like the concept that we would throw around in common conversation of just like the ideal, or just the idealist thing. It's like we never quite get there, but we know that there's something pulling us towards progress.
Okay, now that's right. That's the first thing you should say. But then there's a qualification to introduce here, and that is Derrida is not. The philosophers use this expression, essentialism.
Right.
Derrida is not an essentialist, so he doesn't think that there's a pure essence of justice or democracy or whatever we're talking about, art, whatever it is. He doesn't think there's a pure essence of that thing out there that we're trying to get to.
Right.
He thinks that what's ahead has a kind of radical non-knowability, so that it might be that the democracy to come, we won't even call it democracy. We won't. Our horizons will have been so altered that this word will have become obsolete, and we'll be thinking in other terms. So there's no ideal to approximate empirically. It's a much riskier business than that. It's a much more open-ended business than that. What we know is that something is being promised to us, and if you say, "Well, what?" and his answer is, "I don't know."
Wow.
Something.
Because is that because as soon as you say you have an ideal, you almost have like a tyrannical idea that somebody has to say they understand?
Yeah, that's right. Someone would be hardwired to this ideal essence, and they'd be able to say, well, this is not it, and this is not it, because I know what it is.
Right.
No, there it is. I don't know what it is.
So there's a mystery to it.
Sure. Absolutely. It's got a mysterious... That's why it all sort of looks like negative theology, it looks like mysticism. And it's got certain things in common with that, except, he's not talking about God, he's talking about history, he's talking about the future, he's talking about Europe and democracies and
right.
He's talking about real earthly time-bound things. I mean, he is, from the point of view of the local rabbi or pastor, he's an atheist. So he's not a mystic in any literal sense, but he likes the sort of the discursive resources, the tropes of mysticism, or the way the mystics speak, because the mystics have a way of saying something and then unsaying it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the way he wants to talk about democracy.
Man.
Because he doesn't want to turn it into an essence or an ideal that we are approaching, because that would be Plato. See, that would be the philosopher king who knows the essence.
Right.
And Derrida's thing is, it's too bad we don't have anybody like that. We live in space and time, and all we have are constructions.
Man.
Now, so then you do the same. What I did. So when I read all that, I thought, aha. This is the way to think about religion. It's exactly what religion is. Another one of these constructions. And so there's something undeconstructible in religion, but all the religions we have around us are constructions.
Right.
And so what's that? Well, and then even he started talking like that. At one point he started talking about religion without religion, meaning this thing that's going on in religion that no existing religion can get its head around or can ever claim exclusive rights to knowing. So then you start getting a way to think about faith is much more interesting.
It's almost starting to sound like Bonhoeffer when he was, writing from jail, talking about religionless Christianity.
Exactly.
And nobody really knows what he meant because he never got the chance to express it because he was executed by the Nazis. But there's something very similar that sounds right there.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a fellow named John Skinner who, if you ever noticed online, there's a thing called New Monasticism. I don't know if you've ever noticed New Monasticism. John Skinner is an Anglican priest who runs a thing called New Monasticism, which is an expression from Bonhoeffer, meaning a monasticism of this world, of people who live in the world and work on behalf of people in need in the world.
Yeah.
And so they don't have a church that you come to. They just go out into the world where the real church is, the working church is. And so this man, John Skinner, who runs this new monasticism thing in the United Kingdom, and he's in England right now, very similar to Derrida's notion of religion without religion. I mean, it's got interesting overlaps.
Wow.
You might want to talk to John Skinner sometime.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to connect with him. One last thing, and I want to pass it off to John here. I want to finish up our little intro to your version of deconstruction here. One of the things that first struck me is one of the things John and I try to do on this podcast for people that are unfamiliar with this terminology is people get really nervous when they hear deconstruction because they're like, oh no, they're just doing what those young people, those young hip postmoderns do, and they're just ripping everything apart and being cynical about everything and tearing it all down. And so we always try to balance that out by talking about reconstruction. But it seems to me like when you talk about deconstruction, you are assuming an affirmative. And you've even said deconstruction is love. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a second and explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that particularly when Derrida introduced the notion of the undeconstructible, he's talking about something which is very deeply planted in our hearts, in our desire, and therefore in our love. So we have, it seems to be completely fair to speak of our love of the democracy to come, or the justice to come, or of some religion to come. That would belong to our desire, to our deepest desire, to a desire beyond desire for something for which we lack a vocabulary.
Man.
And so, yeah, he said it. I didn't. I just quoted him. He said deconstruction is love. I would go so far as to say deconstruction is love, he said. It's a love of the undeconstructible, a love of the impossible. He once uses the expression desire beyond desire. This Greek word eros can be translated, we sometimes translate it as erotic love, but it means desire. It means it's something we our most heartfelt desire. So he one time used the expression desire beyond desire.
Yeah.
Which I thought I liked a lot because I thought, well, we have our day-to-day desires, the desire to do our job or to earn a living or to to do, the various daily things we have to do. But then there's a desire we have for something beyond those desires.
Yeah.
A desire for something that we would be quite unable to name or put our finger on.
Yeah.
Something someone said to us, sort of looked us in the eye and sat us down, looked us in the eye and had this kind of spiritual authority and just sort of looked us right in the eye and said, "What do you want? What do you desire?"
Man.
And at that point, you say, "I don't know." Something.
I don't know how to express it, man. So it,
you don't know how to express it. You don't know, and you don't know. You really don't. It's something, and I think it's that open-ended structure of desire, that real, genuine, non-knowing, that keeps the future open.
That is great.
People who know what they want are dangerous. It's people who recognize the open-endedness of the future and the fragility of their own ability to say what they want. That's the sort of the genuinely human condition. That's the finite, fragile human condition.
There's that sound, a moan or a sigh. Sure, I know a hope from a lie.
So for those people that are listening in and they're maybe just starting to get into this kind of idea, and they look at that term deconstruction and see it as a purely negative term, and John and I are constantly trying to say no, there's reconstruction too. But how do you respond to that kind of a view?
Well, in a way, practically everything I've written is in one way or another trying to respond to that criticism.
Right.
And Derrida was too. He I think at a certain point in his life he realized that he was starting to sound like this anything goes relativist. So I think that had a lot to do with his introduction of the word undeconstructible. He introduced it. He used it for the first time in a talk that he gave to lawyers in a law school in New York City, in which he was asked to address the question of the relationship between justice and the law. And so I usually use that talk as a good way to answer the question that you're raising, and that is the distinction he made between the law, which he said is deconstructible. Laws are written, laws are repealed, they're reformed, they're revised, or sometimes they're just completely struck down. So laws are deconstructible. But justice, and this is the way he put it, he says, justice in itself, if such a thing exists, and of course it does not, is not deconstructible. So when you make a distinction between justice and the law, you never want to repeal justice, right?
Right.
You want to repeal the law, and you appeal to justice to repeal the law. So the law is always deconstructible, but the justice in itself is not. And you say, well, then what is justice? And then he says, well, I don't know. It depends. In one situation it's this, in another situation it's that, and if you try to make the rule for one situation, if you try to make justice into a rule based upon one situation, well, then it won't apply to the other situation, because the other situation is always singular. just the way each individual person is singular, or indeed each individual snowflake is singular. And science will tell us that each individual thing has a kind of singularity about it. And justice is that. It's this thing that settles into the singularity of the situation, which doesn't mean it's arbitrary. It just means it's difficult. It requires judgment and a sense for difference, a respect for difference. I mean, whenever anybody is screwed by the law, they always have exactly the same response. The court says this is the law, and the person who's getting screwed by it says, but my case is different. Right? And that's true. That's true. That's why justice in itself, the most you could say is that justice occurs as a spark, as a moment in a singular situation, and then everything changes. And so you can't make a rule out of the singularity of that situation. Justice hovers over those situations and settles into them in singular ways, whereas the laws are rigid and universal. So you try to make the laws as flexible as possible, but you can only do so much with laws.
Wow.
And justice is always coming.
So, with the type of viewers, or listeners rather, not viewers, but listeners that we have on our show, a lot of them are going through kind of this, what we would call kind of a deconstruction, or kind of a process of removing or throwing away just aspects to their faith or their religion that just either don't work anymore, don't apply anymore. And I've noticed that Derrida has been quoted as saying that this idea of not knowing or unknowing is not a weakness. And I know you've also mentioned in your writings that this idea of not knowing does not defeat your sense of religion or prayer. But I know that a lot of the critics out there are going to say, at what point in this kind of stripping away process do you get to the point where it's no longer able to be called religion or Christianity? At what point do you know that you've just stripped away too much?
In general, I would say the problem is not stripping away too much. The problem is having too much built in, which you're not willing to strip away. The problem of violence is not usually the problem. Is not the result of relativism. The great sources. Nobody ever accused Hitler of being a relativist. Nobody ever accused Stalin of being a relativist, and nobody ever accused the church when it burned heretics of being a relativist. So I think in general the problem is that kind of question is displaced. It's usually not relativism that causes trouble. It's usually authoritarianism. And this authoritarianism that produces violence. I would say the point at which you've allowed your process of questioning to become destructive is the point at which it leads to violence. I think that's what we're trying to avoid is violence. Now, normally violence is a result of authoritarianism, but it could be the result of an absolutely libertine, anomic, antinomian refusal to listen to anybody or anything, and to just simply ride roughshod over others. And then your process of questioning has become violent.
Wow.
But normally that would be a kind of extreme libertarian violence. Normally violence is the issue of authoritarianism, not relativism, in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm picking up on in what you're saying, or maybe my imagination is taking it in another direction, is in my experience as a pastor and now a podcaster and just somebody that likes to talk about this kind of stuff, it seems to me that the nervousness that people have, and that I've even experienced myself when it comes to this deconstruction process, is we have fallen in love and started worshiping the construct, and
That's
not.
right.
And so we're kind of like, oh, how much can I change before my God or my tradition or my whatever it is isn't there anymore. And that in what you're saying, it sounds like that's almost nonsense, because you're saying that the God, or the truth, or what you call like the event or the impossible, is always beyond the construct. So you could take the construct completely apart and you haven't done anything but just make a whole lot more room.
Yeah. In religion, you call that idolatry. When you allow that construction to freeze over or to calcify, and then you cling to that, and you say, if you accuse others who depart from it, who separate themselves from that, which is what the word heresy literally means, you accuse them of heresy or of the denial of God, when in fact it's the clinging to certitude and the rigidifying of constructions, which is the real idolatry.
Man, yeah.
And then you see that in particular in the modern church. In both, you can sort of pick your flavor. It either comes in the form of Protestant fundamentalism, which makes the Bible into an idol, or in Catholicism, where you make the institution into an idol, and then you have an exactly parallel notion of papal or institutional infallibility. So you got biblical inerrantism and papal infallibility. You just pick your idol. Pick your poison.
Man.
But they're very similar constructions, and in both cases, what you've done is you've refused to allow the movement of Christianity, or whatever you're talking about, democracy or art or whatever it is. You refuse to allow its movement. You refuse to allow it to remain open to the future, and you freeze it. It becomes like a frozen waterfall, a freeze frame, a pause in a video stream. And it's all of a sudden it's become still, and you say that's the absolute unchanging essence. Well, it's not. It's just a freeze frame. The living things don't have an essence; they have a history. They have a story. You say, what's the essence of Christianity? The answer is, I don't know. It's not over yet.
Oh man.
When it's all over, I'll tell you what it will have been. It's like a dead language, where you really could make up a dictionary once and for all. You'd have the complete, total dictionary of the dead language, because there's nobody around who tomorrow morning is going to get up and create a new metaphor and change the language.
Wow.
It's over. So then you can have an inventory of all the possible things that this will in the language. But insofar as the language is alive, you're constantly revising it. You just have the constant new editions of the dictionary, because living speakers keep changing the language. And see, there's that word inventing. They're exposing the language to the event, and they become inventive speakers, which means they don't let any particular state of the language become normative. They don't let it freeze over. They don't let it calcify, because it's a living language. I mean, even if they try to do it, that won't happen. The future changes, time changes under our feet, whether we like it or not. And so even when people say that they're sticking to the absolute original truth, they're not. The times have changed, words have changed, everything is changing, even though people, it's like they're standing on the earth and they're denying that it's moving. It doesn't appear to be moving, but trust me, it's moving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
That's the way conservatives are, I think, about traditions. They think they're conserving, but by clinging to the past, they conserve it. Well, they don't. It's actually a way to strangle it.
Oh my goodness,
Man.
Well, before we get into your latest work, because we definitely want to promote that to our listeners, one of the ideas I think that you've discussed in your previous work that I think is extremely applicable given today's political climate, just the violence that we see around the world currently, is your idea of the weakness of God and weak theology and what you mean by that. So I was just hoping that for a moment you could unpack what you mean by weakness, because it's definitely not in the sense that we think of weakness.
No, it's the paradoxical weakness described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 1, which is the weakness of God. The expression "the weakness of God" is not mine. I did not make that up. St. Paul beat me to it. And he says, he's talking to the Corinthians, and he says, look, you people are not well born. You're not all that well educated. You're not well off. I mean, he's being very frank with them, and he says he describes them as the tabeantai, the nothings and nobodies of the world. And he says, God has chosen the nothings and the nobodies of the world to put to shame those the powers that be, the strong and the powerful. So he says, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. The weakness of God is stronger, more powerful than human strength. So that's my point of departure. Only I go a little bit farther than St. Paul. I mean, my analysis, where that finally gets you. I mean, I think when you look at the second chapter of 1 Corinthians, you see what Paul's got up his sleeve. He's an apocalyptic thinker, and he thinks in the next chapter that all these people who aren't listening to him in the first chapter are going to be really sorry. They will rue the day they didn't listen to him, because God is coming. And they're all going to get their comeuppance. The goats will be separated from the sheep, and there'll be rewards for those who listen to him, and there will be punishment for those who didn't. And so at that point, I think Paul is revealing that he's got an idea of divine omnipotence or divine power, which is harsh. Now, so I go somewhat farther than Paul by saying he should have stopped when he was ahead in chapter 1 and spared us that apocalyptic conclusion in chapter 2.
Wow.
And I think that because what Paul's saying is, well, look, if you stand with God, you're going to win. God's on your side, and you're going to win. You may not win now, but you'll win tomorrow, and your enemies will be sorry. Well, I think that's a theory of retribution and of resentment. I think that the weakness of God is that, like forgiveness. Forgiveness or loving your enemies. Or offering hospitality when it might be just a little risky to be offering hospitality.
Yeah.
All those are cases of the foolishness of God. And there's no guarantee that you're going to win. And God is not the sort of being who comes in and makes sure you win. God. I don't think God the name of God is the name of a super being or a superhero who comes in the final scene and makes sure that God's friends win. I don't think theology is about winning. I think that the name of God is disclosed in the forgiveness, in the love of enemies, in the hospitality. Period.
Yeah.
Period. Without the economy of reward and punishment, because, for one thing, I mean, apart from what I just said, is I think that it's a theory of resentment and retribution. But just sort of look at the facts, you know. As one theologian put it, a biblical theologian put it, the history of God's intervening on behalf of the just and punishing the unjust is so bad that you have to wonder why the theologians keep bringing it up. You know, and
Yeah.
I think that's really true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, the way things work is that the evil prosper and the good are persecuted for being good.
Yeah.
And the history of God coming in and intervening and straightening all that out is not wonderful. So I think that actually the name of God is not the name of a divine superhero. It's the name of it's what Paul says in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, not the second. And that's what I worked out in a book called The Weakness of God.
I just love the quote that you have in there too, where you say, by refusing to trade strong force for strong force, the weakness of forgiveness can break the deadly cycle for physical retaliation. I think that resonates so much with me, you know, based on just what we're seeing in today's media and the news. I just want to point out. I love
just the
that quote.
political climate that we're in. I mean, let's not beat around the bush here. Like, this isn't a podcast that leans one way or another politically. I don't even know how you could anymore.
Right.
But I mean, this is absent.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. the current political climate.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope we're out of time and I don't have to talk about that because it's too depressing.
You do
Exactly.
not. It is. We don't mind getting a little sad on this podcast because philosophers are good at being sad, but we're not going to go that sad.
All right.
That is good. That is too sad. Before we get into your book, Jack, I just had one more question. I'm trying to think like my old super conservative Bible worshiping self from way back in the day, and what kind of I always like to think about how my 18-year-old self would critique my 35-year-old self, and if my 18-year-old self was here listening to this conversation, or if my parents 15, 20 years ago were listening to this conversation, they would say, well, hang on a second. Paul was very clear in Galatians when he said, if anyone comes and starts to preach a gospel other than exactly what I said here, let them be anathema, cursed, forever. And I think that people use that as like a stick to keep new ideas from forming, to keep people in line. It's like, here's my approved message, and that's exactly what Paul said, and it's exactly what Jesus said, and it's exactly what God said. And it's like, again, they're giving you this. They're giving you the not the ideal, but as you like to call it, maybe the impossible or the event, or they're giving you the truth that the beliefs cannot contain, and they're saying, I have it, here it is. Do you have you've been sort of responding to that a little bit throughout the whole podcast, but I wonder, has anybody ever said that to you, and how do you respond to something like that?
Oh, God, yeah. Sure. I mean, I've, over the years, been invited to conservative places, and and I've gotten an earful. And then nowadays, you get, you're exposed because people can just email you or get on your Facebook page and say things. Yeah, sure, all the time I get that. It's a good case of idolatry, in this case, biblical idolatry, just trying to take a word, a sentence, and use it, as you said, use it as a stick.
Yeah.
Beat your plowshare into a sword and turn it into a stick to whip somebody with.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the scriptures are full of a lot of things. For one thing, Paul got kicked out of just about every place he visited eventually because he caused so much trouble. And he wasn't being kicked out by Romans or Greeks. He was being kicked out by the Jews.
Yeah,
listening to him. And his own mission, I think, historically, he was a bit of a failure. And what happened was he caught a wave, he caught a break. What happened, I think, is that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Aramaic-speaking Jewish followers of Jesus were scattered or killed. And all that was left were the Gentile-speaking followers, and all they had to go on, since they were second and third generation by then, they had never laid eyes on Jesus, all they had to go on were the letters of Paul.
Right.
And the letters of Paul, which were just letters, became scripture.
Yeah.
So Paul's, he fought with everybody, and he happened to win, I think, historically. But he didn't win in his own lifetime, and it was only because he had the ability to write, which brings you back to Derrida on the way in which traditions are founded upon writing and the power of writing.
Man.
Because they can be passed on from generation to generation independent of the original context. And which is why they demand interpretation, which is why somebody who tries to use them as a stick doesn't understand the nature of a written text. So then you get into some of the more technical sides of Derrida's work, his early work, when he was talking about the nature of a written text.
Mm.
And what we know about a written text is that it is, in principle, recontextualizable. It has a context when it's written, but because it's written, it can survive the context.
Right.
Context can change, and therefore the text can be recontextualized, and that keeps on going.
Yeah.
And then you form a tradition when you have a string of recontextualizations that hang together around an individual text.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to say that any one version of that text is normative.
Man. Well, we could go.
If it's a text. If it's a text, it's recontextualizable.
Yeah, we just recontextualize and recontextualize. So we're doing what Derrida is essentially saying. We're just not almost admitting it in a lot of ways. It's like we're doing it all the time because we can never get back to the totally pure essence, like you say, and freeze the waterfall. Yeah. So we're constantly having to talk about it again in a new context and talk about it again in a new context. And
right.
Yeah, it just goes on and on.
When words are powerful enough, you can do that with them. If they're not, they just die off. As soon as the context changes, they die off. They're so time-bound that they have no use, or they have no survival value after the context changes. But if somebody says something striking, then this can survive the context, and it admits of being recontextualized. And that's when you get the tradition.
Man, we could go all day. I would love to get a cup of coffee with you that would last 3 days. Just a giant cup of coffee, and just continue to ask. I wish I could have been one of your students, Jack. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to be respectful of your time, but really what we want is for this podcast and this episode, this conversation, to just be an appetizer to get people out there and get your books. The one that I'm going to recommend for people that have no experience with your work at all is the book by Baker Academic, which I thought was very accessible. You use a lot of popular ideas, TV shows like The Wire and Lost and some other concepts that really make your ideas very, very accessible. And that's called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? But your new book, your newest book, is called Hoping Against Hope.
Yeah, there's two new books out. They both came out around the same time. One is called Hoping Against Hope, and that has the advantage of being sort of autobiographical.
Yeah.
I sort of tell my story about growing up in pre-Vatican II Catholicism, and I weave the sorts of things we're talking about together.
Yeah,
with my autobiography. So it's part spiritual memoir and then part sort of theological reflection. The other one's called The Folly of God, and that's we didn't say Foolishness of God because there's already a book out there called Foolishness of God. But again, it's taken from 1 Corinthians 1. where the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men.
Yeah.
And I pursue what we've just been saying in terms of the dynamic of wisdom and foolishness. And if you happen to know anything about Paul Tillich, that book tries to bring together what Derrida talks about under the name of the unconditional. He calls the undeconstructible the unconditional, with what Tillich calls the unconditional, namely a matter of ultimate concern.
Wow.
And so you've got a way to bring Tillich and Derrida together, and I think it's fertile to bring them together. Just the way we were saying before, that there are interesting overlaps between Derrida and Bonhoeffer. I think there's also interesting overlaps between Derrida and Tillich. So the folly of God does that. So if any of your readers know anything about Tillich, that would be a handle for them for that book.
The great thing about our audience, Jack, is people are hungry and they want to hear new ideas. And the great thing about your work and other people like you that do these kinds of work is you take these people that we would otherwise find inaccessible and you bring them down to a level almost like C.S. Lewis used to do. He would take these guys that, nobody's going to read Rudolph Otto. I'm not going to read Rudolph Otto. But Lewis did, and he would read all these other medievals and bring their ideas together in a way that sounds like you're talking with somebody at a pub. And I just think that what you do is so valuable, and for people that don't want to crack open Jacques Derrida and maybe don't want to get the courage to be by Tillich, we hope you do, but I also hope you get Jack Caputo's work, Hope Against Hope, and read that. And really, specifically, your concept about God insisting instead of existing, I think is very, very interesting. I wish we could get into that a little bit, but you've just got so much out there, and we just so appreciate the work that you've done to make space for spiritual claustrophobics like us. That's what we call ourselves a lot of times.
Well, you don't sound very claustrophobic to me, but we all have to keep ourselves off balance, kind of, like to say, optimal equilibrium, so that we keep ourselves open, exposed, and ready for something that we weren't ready for.
Just as a by way of closing, I wonder if you could offer some advice and maybe speak to one of the ways we close all our episodes is we always assume that there are people listening here that are undergoing a crisis of faith, and maybe they're more fundamentalist in nature and experiencing that kind of trauma. And then there's also people on the opposite side that are coming, instead of from Tillich's perspective, maybe more from Derrida's perspective, and they are, very skeptical but spiritually curious. So we have this spectrum of the fundamentalist all the way to the more science-minded atheist. And I wonder if you could just, in closing, kind of address them both with some words of wisdom.
Well, yeah, the way to think about that, I think, is understand the way that faith and doubt, and certainty and uncertainty interweave with each other and make each other possible. It's only when things are dubious and clouded that you need to have faith. Otherwise, your faith is dogmatic. And by the same token, the only reason you would be disturbed about your uncertainty and your doubt is that you're looking for something, and your heart is restless, as St. Augustine says. And there's something you want, and you feel the pain. It's like feeling pain. That's a good thing, because it means that it's the body signaling you that there's something wrong. Well, doubt and uncertainty are a little bit like that. They're signs of life, of desire, of a love of something I know not what, and there's signs that you're searching. So, to the dubious, congratulations on your doubt. It means you're looking for something. Doubt is not the same as despair. Despair is the more serious problem. But if you're riddled with doubts and it keeps you up at night, you're on the right track. You're doing fine. It's when you stop worrying about your doubts and you just you become utterly indifferent to them, that you're in trouble. And on the other end, if you're absolutely sure you're right, then you know you're wrong.
Oh
you
man,
left something out. You're doing something wrong. Because
wow.
a genuine faith, I think, is struggling. You're saved. This is a sort of paraphrase of Paul Tillich, but it's not bad. You're saved by doubt, not by faith.
Wow.
You're saved by the faith that's in doubt and the doubt that's in faith. So both sides should keep the same thing in mind. The faith and doubt interweave. Certainty, knowledge and non-knowledge interweave. You see that in science. Whenever the scientists discover something new, they find they've got a dozen new problems they didn't know they had before.
Oh, man.
So the two work together, and they keep things in motion. Everything's deconstructible. It's always being reformed, rethought, refined. It's always it's a little bit stable, but then again, it's a little bit unstable.
Jack,
Wow.
have you ever dropped the mic before? Because I think you should drop the mic right now.
Holy cow.
Drop the mic.
Yeah, well, there's a phrase that young people use when you say something when nothing more needs to be said, and you just drop the mic and walk off
Drop the
stage.
mic, Never heard that before.
Well, that'll be the only time we've ever taught you something. So there you go. I can see no better way to end our time together. So very quickly, what is the best way for folks to stay on top of the latest that you're working on?
Well, I have an author Facebook page that will let people know what I'm up to. It's called John D. Caputo Week Theology, and that I announce my lectures and what I'm doing next on there.
Perfect.
So that'll keep them up to date. And right now I'm working on a book on hermeneutics. I've been working on hermeneutics one way or another all my life. That's a theory of interpretation. And I'm working on a book on interpretation right now called The Interpretive Imperative. The subtitle is, I think, The Notion of Postmodern Hermeneutics, something like that.
Wow.
But anyway, I have a Facebook page called, if you just do look up Week Theology, you'll find me, and then that will tell you what I've been doing and what I am doing next.
And we will definitely put that link on our show notes, as well as the best places to go out and get some of your books. We just cannot thank you enough for the time that you spent with us and just sharing some of your thoughts with us.
I've enjoyed it, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Oh, we will
would love
definitely take you up on that offer.
Okay.
Well, Jack, thank you very, very, very much.
You're quite welcome.
We'll talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Talking over tape delay, you're following me anyway, through a like or a conversation. Living through a telephone, shame I always feel alone, in a fog of all the information. In hearts I've met,
So,
never seen.
dude, I have one question for you. And it's, are we blessed by the sovereign hand of the Lord? I mean,
I think we must be at this point.
that interview was, we need to make this outro very, very short, because you know what I want everybody to do right now?
Go buy his books.
Go buy his books and listen to that freaking interview all over again, because that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this, we're not going to overcomplicate it.
Nope.
Deconstruction is love. It's an affirmative. Weak theology. God, weak theology.
How cool.
Oh,
That's the first thing I picked up on when I started reading up on his material, and I was like, what a fascinating concept.
man. So we got to get him back, because as versed as he is in the thought of Jacques Derrida, which informs a lot of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Another theologian that we love that overlaps so much with Jacques Derrida is Paul Tillich.
Yeah.
And his last book, Hope Against Hope,
Yeah.
and The Folly of God, I think all have to do with Tillich. Mm-hmm. And my brain is mush right now because I'm just so enthusiastic about what just happened. Wow.
Just, dude. Yeah.
Man, okay, so John and I, we're not going to make a big thing out of this. Listen to the interview again.
Mm-hmm.
That was such a treat, man. This is one of those things where it's like, we're going to be like talking to our kids someday and be like, oh yeah, that time we like talked to Jack Caputo for an hour or two. Like, yeah, that time.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Guys, like, I don't even know. I hope the people listening at home enjoy kind of the variety of guests that we have coming on the show at this point. Because, at the beginning, like, we've said this before, we didn't really know what we were doing entirely. We were just happy and lucky and fortunate to get, some of the guests that we got on originally. And now we've kind of slowed it down a little bit and kind of been more intentional about, who we have on when, and we're trying to play with the calendar and everything. And so I just hope that you guys enjoy as much as we've been enjoying bringing these interviews to you. These philosophers we're bringing on, and the scientists, and the bloggers and the authors and the theologians.
You know what I love about this so much? Do you know how like a really good radio station, not that you and I are a really good radio station,
we'd be a
there's
terrible one.
Some overlap in this analogy. Like, if you're listening to a great radio station, or even like a great Pandora station, or like whatever, you're going to kind of get a taste of what you already know you like. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to get a whole bunch of things that you hadn't heard of before that you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know how much I like this.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about a lot of the people we get on. And Jack Caputo, I'd say, is one of my crown jewels of like, a year ago, I had no idea who this guy was.
Yeah.
And now I'm devouring his work. I'm finished with like my second book. By the way, I love Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
He has got an amazing book on how to read Kierkegaard. So if you're out there and you've always kind of wanted to like, be at a party, a cocktail party, and everybody's having drinks and you want to spit some Kierkegaard because, like you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you do.
Yeah.
Jack Caputo can help you with that. Get his book, How to Read Kierkegaard. I cracked it open. It's in my bathroom right now. Every time, I'm in the bathroom, I'm spending some time.
Everybody else has got random trivia. You've got
Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
I've got Jack Caputo on how to read Kierkegaard.
Of course you do.
Let me tell you something, though. Like a good radio station, we are bringing people, Catherine Hayhoe, Jack Caputo. I mean, there's some people that have tweeted at us like, I didn't know who Science Mike was before this. I'm like, that's tragic for you.
Yeah, that's unimaginable.
Yeah, but like so many people. Did I already say Pete Rollins?
Not yet.
Pete Rollins, I mean, that's what I love about what we're doing here. It's like people connect with this whole expansion, deconstruction. The more comes into what you already have and like makes room for itself. It ruptures, it deconstructs, but it's always a part of reconstruction as well. Jack Caputo, man, everybody needs to go pick up, if you can pick up one book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? Pick it up by Baker Academic. It's a series that's edited by James K. A. Smith. It's absolutely fantastic. Check it out. Who's this sweet music we're listening to, though?
Dude.
You found these people.
Yeah. This is a husband and wife duo.
Gosh, so
and
good.
They're incredibly generous and nice. And we reached out to them not that long ago, and they immediately got back to us within less than 24 hours, and they were like, absolutely use our music.
So good.
And, they talked a little bit about, their faith background, everything. Super, super generous, though. They're called the Well Pennies. If you haven't heard of them and you like a little acoustic folk mixed with like, just a tiny taste of the country.
Civil Wars meets like Shovels and Rope meets like... just your folky Americana. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with Mandolin Orange or so much good music out there. We're doing this all for you guys.
Yeah.
We love you guys.
So not only do you get hopefully some interviews with some people that maybe you didn't know before,
nuggets,
maybe present some information that you've never heard before,
nuggets.
But we've been trying to up our music game, and so we were bringing you hopefully artists that maybe you haven't heard of before.
Yeah.
Some you will have heard of, some of the bands that, most of them probably you may not have heard of. And that's why we've been putting them, all their information in our show notes. So if you guys like the music that we're playing on here,
Check them out.
please check them out. Go buy their music. The Well Penny is just another great example of just
Amazing.
and they both sing lead vocals, both the husband and the wife. They both have killer voices.
Dude, I
and,
bet most
just
of the people
incredible.
listening to this have never heard of the Well Pennies, which is tragic,
Tragic.
and have never heard of Jack Caputo. And he dropped the mic on this episode.
Dude, go get his book and
He dropped the mic.
listen to the Well Pennies while you're reading it.
Hashtag Jack Caputo drops the mic.
Yes.
That's this episode.
I like it.
Man, we love you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting us do this. Thank you for letting us be raw and unprofessional and having a blast and doing this deconstruction thing with you. We love you tons.
Love, love, love.
For now, we are your hosts,
I am John Williamson.
and I am Adam Narlock. Keep deconstructing, everyone.
Maybe it could amaze me if I were to step outside my door. And when, 'cause it would surely happen, discovering all that land and sea, and no one knows but me. And I've got nothing to do today, and I don't want it any other way. So I am gonna sail myself away, 'cause I've got nothing to do today. Oh, I go wherever the wind blows, whatever I build inside my head. Lately, I've got a whole lot of spark in me. Don't wanna lose that lonely glow, the only thing I know. And I've got nothing to do today, 'cause I don't want it any other way. So I am gonna sail myself away, 'cause I've got nothing to do today. I've got nothing to do today. Oh, feel that hope arising, sun is shining, find the light in anything. Maybe it could amaze me if I were to step outside my door.